So I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Ms. Bandana Pattanaik, and she is currently the international coordinator for the Global Alliance. Sorry, excuse me. There we go. She's currently the coordinator, the international coordinator for the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women. And last week, I think we had her colleague join us. And GATW is a feminist alliance that works on women's rights in the context of labor migration. And prior to GATW, Bandana was working in academia and publishing in India and in Australia on the subject of trafficking. Ms. Bandana, if I could just ask you to come in. You know, this year is marking the 20th anniversary of the Palermo Protocol. And what are your thoughts in terms of the progress that has been made so far in preventing, combating, and eradicating human trafficking? And so around this question, I think it would be great for us to hear also a bit more about the work that you do in your organization and what you think your work in the organization, of course, in partnership with others. And please feel free to mention those, because we also have students in the room who would like to understand other actors. The kind of work that you're doing at GAAWT, what has made a significant contribution to the anti-trafficking movement? And here we're particularly talking about anti-trafficking of women over the past years. And you are, you know, please feel free to tell us, you know, some of Ms. Bandana, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Paddy, and thank you to MFA and all other colleagues for this opportunity. Paddy, you had far too many questions for me, so so I would like to go step by step. What I was thinking, and I'm very mindful of the fact that well, time is short, but also there is an online course that MFA is giving, so there are students. So what I would actually like to do in the first 2 or 3 minutes is to look at the text of GCM 10 vis-a-vis the Palermo Protocol and see where they diverge and where they converge, and then I'll move on to the next segment of my talk. So GCM Objective 10 aims to prevent, combat, and eradicate trafficking in persons in the context of international migration. So while trying to understand this objective, it's really necessary to look at it in conjunction with at least 2 other international instruments, namely the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, otherwise known as the Palermo Protocol, and, quite importantly, the OHCHR recommended principles and guidelines on human rights and human trafficking. The protocol, as we all know, sits within a convention to address transnational organized crime. The OHCHR document is a set of strong recommendations which closely followed the Palermo Protocol. So GCM 10 commits to take legislative and other measures to, as I said, prevent, combat, and eradicate trafficking in the context of international migration by strengthening capacities and international cooperation to investigate, prosecute, and penalize trafficking in persons, to discourage demand that fosters exploitation, and to end impunity of trafficking networks. It also commits to enhance the identification and protection of and assistance to migrants who have become victims of trafficking. So the first thing to remember while trying to understand GCM 10 is that its specific commitments and the first 2 action points, which are the ratification of Palermo Protocol, and it also makes very explicit reference to Global Plan of Action and the toolkit of UNODC. So these 2 actually place human trafficking as it is understood within GCM firmly within the realm of crime. So GCM 10 also explicitly aims to follow the lead of UNODC and to strengthen the important work that UNODC has carried out to address trafficking over the last 2 decades. So while GCM 10 does not contradict the OHCHR guidelines anywhere, it also doesn't explicitly mention it, nor does it make any explicit mention of rights of trafficked persons. Secondly, it's also important to note that the scope of GCM 10 is narrower than that of Palermo Protocol. GCM's focus, as is its mandate, is on international migrants. Therefore, it limits itself to look at trafficking in the context of cross-border migration. Trafficking, as we know, can happen within national borders. Then coming to, I have a few specific comments on GCM 10 vis-a-vis Palermo Protocol. I think in some points, few of its action points, GCM Objective 10 does go beyond the protocol. Let's look at action point 3, for example. It's about international borders. It is very important for us to note that this objective is not recommending stringent border control measures as a trafficking prevention strategy. Article 11.1 of the protocol, in contrast, explicitly formulates an obligation upon its state parties to strengthen border controls. As GATW and many other organizations have pointed out on the basis of empirical research, stringent border control has done nothing to prevent human trafficking. It has only aggravated the vulnerability of working class migrants and have put many of them in harm's way. So the mild and rather vague action point of GCM 10 to monitor irregular migration routes can be seen as a migrant worker friendly thing. Let's just hope that this milder formulation does not become a sugar-coated legitimization for ongoing policing and surveillance of migrant workers. However, the second part of action point 3 is worth keeping an eye on. This can be a bit of a slippery slope. While talking about monitoring migration routes, this action point also mentions cross-border cooperation. If the kind of cooperation that EU member states are currently implementing is any indication, then this can easily backfire on migrant workers. Basically, in the name of cooperation, EU member states are funding countries of origin and transit to strengthen their borders. A glaring example of this is supporting and training the Libyan coast guards and providing them with surveillance equipment and intelligence. In the EU migration policy documents, these are justified as the need to save migrants' lives and to combat human smuggling and human trafficking. This covert support for policing of borders obviously lets the state that funds out of the hook of any human rights obligations. So therefore, we will need to be careful that GCM 10 does not give further endorsements to such measures. Then action point 5, which talks about protection and access to justice, is definitely stronger than the provisions in the protocol. There are a few good case examples in this regard, which can be used in future. The most well-known, of course, is the European Court of Human Rights judgment on Chaudhary and others versus Greece, where the Strasbourg court actually found that applicants were victims of human trafficking and forced labor. We can also look up to the OHCHR guidelines for further guidance. Then we can come to action points 7 and 8, which are also worth looking at. Here too, the assistance measures are certainly more strongly worded than they are in the Palermo Protocol. Note the injunctions to avoid criminalization of migrants who are victims of trafficking, non-conditional assistance to trafficked persons, temporary or permanent residence permit, and access to justice, including compensation. Coming 18 years after the protocol, the drafters of GCM had the advantage of the experience during these intervening years and several other sort of policy documents on trafficking in persons, including the Council of Europe Convention, of course. Action points 9 and 10, I would argue, are something to be very careful about. These are seemingly non-controversial and innocuous soft suggestions, which talk about wide-ranging trainings, education, and awareness-raising programs. Everyone loves trainings and awareness-raising programs, NGOs, donors, everybody. The flip sides of wide-ranging education programs, which mandate everyone to keep an eye on trafficking, is that it gives everybody a license to become James Bond. There are many examples of community surveillance measures that have made lives of poor migrating people, especially women, difficult. There are examples of unethical rescues which have violated the rights of migrant workers, in the informal sector. So we've come a long way from awareness raising trainings that were talking about the horrors of trafficking. Millions of dollars and much efforts later, people in the anti-trafficking community realized that prospective migrant workers are actually aware of the possible bad outcomes of migration, but most of them are confident that it would not happen to them. It's that realization that made anti-trafficking community and many others in the migrant rights community to stop talking about horrors of trafficking, but to talk about safe migration information programs, or to implement safe migration information programs. While the efficacy of the safe migration programs is another matter, the framing of action point 10 of GCM is certainly a bit narrow. My last and final comment on the text and action points on GCM 10 vis-a-vis the protocol is with regard to their titles. While the protocol aims to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, GCM 10's expressed aim is to prevent, combat, and eradicate trafficking in persons. The military and medical wording like combat and eradicate and its limited focus on international migrants notwithstanding, we can argue that GCM 10 has a much broader vision. It actually hopes to see an end to trafficking. How it plans to do that is not clear from the action points, but we can certainly applaud the vision and work with the states to make that happen. Paddy, I think I will stop here for now and come back a bit later to share some reflections on the progress made so far. Is that okay?
Yes, that's okay. And I think I think you have really given us a great dive into the subject, even just by breaking down and pointing out what are those key points within that that objective as well, you know, breaking it down for us. And I think also giving us a bit of a homework, isn't it? Especially for actors on the ground who maybe would have taken, and I like the last point that you made on you know, looking at points 9 and 10 that talk about this, you know, this awareness raising and how we can sort of get very locked into awareness raising and forgetting the complexity that goes with the issue of trafficking. And here I'm reminded of, you know, I worked in China for about 3 years, and also following a bit on the concept of marriage migration and looking at it in the context of trafficking and how complex just that relationship can be. And therefore, when we are going into an awareness raising mode, what does that actually mean? So I wanted to just see if you could come back with us later on, you know, in terms of, you know, what you talked about, first touching on the fact that, you know, this cross-border element seems to be the big emphasis. So how do we bring in the internal trafficking? Because we do know that there are transnational links. So if they're linking both from the internal to the external, how are we making those linkages? And maybe a few examples of some of the work you have done could make it also easy for us to sort of see what are the natural linkages that could be done in addressing this from an international perspective, but dealing with trafficking in an internal context. And I think also touching a bit on, you know, how we can move in the right direction. So we move away from financing, capacity building, and awareness workshops where we know that there are deeply rooted issues and how we can really solve them, maybe by giving an example from, I don't know, a marriage migration angle or from a different angle of your expertise. And, you know, just as I leave you with that, just to say thank you for that deliberation that you have given us.